Computer. Okay, hi, this is Jeff with New World Chaos, and today I'm talking with Phil Gosselin. Gosselin or Gosselin?
Yeah, Gosselin. Yeah, that's fine.
Gosselin. He is a filmmaker and he's the founder of Newtown, which he's gonna talk to us a little bit about. So I guess we should just get started. What is Newtown?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What is Newtown? So the very, very short answer is that Newtown is a cultural certification. So filmmakers, writers, musicians, people who produce games, whether video games or board games, culture at large. People who produce culture, they certify their culture with Newtown, right? So just as I have a bottle of Pepsi here. There's a core certification, which is a kosher certification here in Canada. I believe in America there are more than one kosher certification, but here in Canada we only have this one, and so it's the same principle, right? So people who are kosher can look at this product and go, oh wow, I can safely and easily just grab this thing because it fits with my dietary standards, right? So when it comes to culture, what Newtown does is that it certifies that there's no it certifies three things really: that there's no the content of the culture is just culture, right? It's not woke sort of heterodox, orthodoxy propaganda, right? And so there's the content. There's also the person who made it, right? The makers of that culture are heterodox as well, and so the means of production, you could say, and lastly, it's the funding. So how the how that piece of culture was funded was through heterodox money, because there's such a thing as woke capital, which is huge right now. It's in the trillions, really. So with the asset management firms like BlackRock and Vanguard and these people, they have trillions at their disposal. So to make sure that culture is not, so to speak, infected by woke capital, that's the third step that Newtown takes to make sure that the culture at hand is free of all that.
Is there any non-woke capital that can compete with that right now?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there certainly is. I mean, when I look at investors, so I've launched a Newtown in February, and I sort of conceive of it between November and February, and we can talk about the genesis of Newtown later on. That's a cool story. But during my research, I've looked into a lot of angel investor groups and venture capitalist groups, and people that I know well. I've been here in Toronto. I've been involved heavily in that space for a number of years, even so far as being the official photographer for the Opium Network, which hosted a pitch contest almost twice a month, and I've whether they're here or in Austin, Texas, or New York City, or on the West Coast, angel investors are angel investors. They don't really, I mean, in Europe they might have a different mindset, but here in North America they pretty much think the same. And then during my research I found that they're people too, and so they some of the groups out there are, they have clear DEI and sort of woke mission statements. And so, how will that translate into the startups that they fund? That's everybody's guess. But usually, when you preach something, when you believe in something, you put it into practice, right? I mean, that's the best way to instantiate your belief, right? So, I mean, I think it's a safe bet to assume that down the line, angel investor groups who have a very DEI mindset will probably reject applications based on gender, based on ethnicity and whatever, right? So I haven't really found sort of the opposite, angel investor groups or venture capitalist groups that are heterodox, but I believe they're out there. And I mean, if these people are people, and they, they can be swayed, I'm sure that they belong to, some of them belong to one group and others to the other, so to speak.
But you have identified kind of a market for, I'm going to call it anti woke art, but for this like non woke content, right?
Yeah, well, I actually call it true culture, in the sense that culture is culture just the way it's supposed to be,
And
right?
not ideology.
Yes, exactly. So I mean, there's a cool thing that happened, about, well, right about, the first, the election of Trump, I would say, and the rise of Jordan Peterson, and it's sort of 2014, 2015, in that time frame, um, where the media, the mainstream media, became very, very to the left, right? And it has been growing to the left ever since. But thanks to free market, yeah, to the free market economy, there's been a great, a great revitalization of information, so to speak, in that regard. So that's why you have people like Jordan Peterson, like Dave Rubin, like Joe Rogan, who have had tremendous success, and they've had pretty much 20% growth every year since 2015, 2016. And there's no stopping it, absolutely no stopping it. And the numbers I have, they're just based off YouTube. They're not, the Daily Wire, for instance, is huge on Facebook. I think 80% of their audience is on Facebook and not on YouTube, for instance. And so the market economy, it really did its job, in the sense that people look at CNN or hear CBC in Canada, and it's like, you know what, I don't want this. I don't want to give my eyeballs to these bozos. And so, hey, here it is on YouTube. There's some people that make sense, that want to talk about the news, so I'm going to give them my eyeballs. And I use the term eyeballs here because that's the term marketers use, right?
That's the
Because right, so that's you need eyeballs, right? Because that's what drives publicity, right? That's what drives ad revenue. And so there's a tremendous shift in the information space, right? But there is none in culture, right? So what's going on here? Why isn't culture sort of following? Well, there are two reasons, and they're quite simple. First is that in culture, people who run cultural industries are very progressive. You'll never see a pro-Trump film in Hollywood. Never. They'll never greenlight a project like that. And I mean, look, remember, what was it, George W., the Oliver Stone film? The sort of
Oh,
biopic that he made. So I mean, that was met with. I don't know how he got funded. That would be nice to look into, but I'm pretty sure he probably got most of his money outside of Hollywood, because he wouldn't find a nickel in Hollywood to make that film. Now I haven't seen it, to be, I which is weird because I love Stone. But I've heard it's sort of balanced. It's not really pro Bush, but still, it's still something that Hollywood execs wouldn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. It feels like it's poison to them, right? So that's sort of the first aspect. And the second aspect is, as we know, cancel culture. Cancel culture has been tremendous in keeping people in line. And not too long ago on Twitter, someone was saying, hey, there hasn't been any cancellation lately. Why is that? And I replied, well, because it works. Because we call it. I've been in the industry for 20 years, film industry, video production industry, and so forth, and we call it the industry. Right? Not It's one gigantic thing. Even if you're in music or in television, we're all connected. We all know each other in some form or another. And I've been to the Toronto Film Festival here, I think it's 4 or 5 times. And, as soon as the second year started, I started seeing the same people, and it's a huge festival. So they understand when they cancel people, they understand, right? They're not going to go anywhere else, right? So people toe the line. And so that's why it's been sort of quiet on that front. Nobody's really making a ruckus or anything, right? So, but all the while, sort of in parallel, you could see that people who were consuming the information from that didn't come from mainstream were puzzled by this. Like, hey, what about culture? why don't we have culture that's like this sort of alternative information that we have? And I believe the what I just gave you, this sort of two-prong answers, is basically what it is.
So they have the industry or everyone in line now. I'm worried about its impacts on creativity because aren't artists and creators the trailblazers, the mavericks, the pioneers at the cutting edge of culture and what's coming? And it seems like if it's all captured, we lose that. Like what that the spirit that allows them to create in the first place, where is that in all of this? Have they succeeded in suppressing that, or will it go independent? Are there independent filmmakers maybe that can take up the mantle and continue culture?
Well, that's very that's a great question, and it's I would say it's very complex, because culture is a mix of many things. It's a mix of intent, the artist and his or her intent. It's about distribution. It's about funding. And so, I mean, here in Canada, the and I'm not gonna dwell on that a lot because it's a huge story and it's very complex. But most of culture here in Canada is publicly funded, or at least in part publicly funded. There's nothing of scope that's done here that doesn't receive any money from the government in local, provincial, or federal level. Sometimes all three of them, right? So, and now the Council for the Arts back in April has released its new strategic plan for the next 5 years, and it wasn't even subtle. It was we want to decolonize culture in Canada.
What does that mean?
So yeah, so and we all know what that means, right? It's like everybody,
Oh,
well, it's everybody except the white guy, right?
oh, okay.
So everybody except the white patriarchy, so to speak, right? And so, but to me, this wasn't surprising because at least 3 years ago, not almost 4 years ago, I had discussions with people in the industry, and they were like, "Hey, if you want to get into, for instance, the Canadian Film Center, which is the top Canadian film school here, and that happened to be here in Toronto, forget it. It's if you're a guy and you're white, forget it. That's never going to happen." Uh,
That's that
but
sounds discriminatory.
well, well, we don't have the Constitution here, right? We have a
Oh,
Bill of Rights. That's all we have. And but so when the council released their plan, I wasn't surprised because the people within the industry, they already do that. They, at the sort of the highest level, they've already sort of imposed quotas. So when you have quotas like that, you're sort of funneling the storytelling, you're funneling stories, you're telling people what you want them to, because it's all about you submit, right? You have a project, you submit it to whether it's the council or you submit it to another government apparatus, and they're sort of like, hey, why don't you talk about this, why don't you talk about that? So it's not like it's self-censorship. It's not like the artists will self-censor, but it's sort of guided creativity. And the same thing is happening in England too. The BBC is all about quotas now. It's all about telling very particular stories. And I was in touch with a young woman who works for Counterweight, the organization, and she's an aspiring screenwriter, and she wanted to participate in a BBC contest, for newcomers, and they're like, wow, we're excited to have you. And it's like, oh, we read your story, but do you mind if maybe the main character could be a reflection of you as a woman, in this day and age, or could you have more characters like this and characters like that? And she was like, look, this is what I wrote, and if you don't like it, you don't, and of course they never call back, right? So yeah, so there's sort of this sort of top-down censorship that, and in America, well, even though it's not government funded, it's still the same people, right? So they're just going to use this. When I say the same people, should say the same mindset, right? It's exactly the same mindset. So they'll push a narrative, right? So it's very tough because for an artist, that wants to break, if you're a local artist and you just want to do your thing, that's one thing, but if you want to if you have aspirations and if you have ambition, and well, you're going to hit that. You're going to hit that wall at one point, and so you have to decide. Either you cave in, or you just do it. And for a lot of artists, they don't have to cave in because they already feel that way. Like I said earlier, the artists are very liberal and progressive minded. So there's to them it just makes sense, for writers and directors and music composers and lyric composers and whatnot. So yeah, so there's it's like there's no shortage of people who will or willing to do that, right? But then the flip side to that is that people who just want to tell stories, whether it's whatever it is, or and you know how it is these days. Like if you're not black, you can't write a black story, right? So it's or you can't if you're a male, you can't write female characters. It almost goes there, right? So yeah, so it's either stifling, it's just, hey, you can't do this, or you're on your own. And the thing with you're on your own is that, well, you're on your own, right? It's like it's up to you to find your distributor, to find your funding, to find everything, and that's one hill to climb. Whereas if you're part of the industry, it's just everything's just given. If you toe the line and you go with the current, well, you're just going to have the money, you're just going to find the distributors and so forth.
It seems easier in this day and age to create. Like people are creating entire albums from their bedroom, or they can create an entire movie on their phone. And so if an independent creator like yourself, let's say you put together a film, you find a distributor, you find funding, it's packaged, it's ready to go. Is the algorithm gonna keep it from reaching is it at the mercy of, are there algorithms that drive this above and beyond the people or the humans in the industry? And is that a danger as well? Like how would it reach the audience that it's intended to reach?
Well, you see, that's great. Because the thing about Newtown is that it's a top-down sort of solution to woke in our culture. And what I mean by that is that we now know that, for instance, Ben Shapiro is going to be producing movies, right? So he's opening an arm. He's whatever company he has, he's opening a production arm, and he's going to produce films, right? So, but maybe 5 every 2 to 3 years or something like that. So it's not like his output is going to be gigantic, but what he's doing is very important. But it's bottom up. It's a bottom up solution, right? It's unit, right? He's producing units. What Newtown does is that instead of it doesn't produce anything, it doesn't distribute anything. It just says, hey, we're going to differentiate between two things. We're going to help you, the consumer, differentiate between two things. Because if there's one thing we know, is that, let's say you and I, let's suppose that we have a choice right now. We're sitting in front of that screen, and we only have 2 options on the screen. We can only pick one of 2 films, right? The first one is sort of typical Hollywood film that may or may not be woke, and the second one is the same. It's a suspense. It has the same level of hecting. It has the same budget, and it's apples to apples here, right? But it has the Newtown logo on it, and that means that it's just a film. It's just meant to be entertaining, right? It's just meant to be a piece of culture that will hopefully bring you something, right? So it's the same price too, right? So I know I would choose option B, right? And I'd like to assume you would as well, right? And so the idea here is that Newtown sort of separates culture into 2, right? So it tells people like Ben Shapiro and all the others who want to do their own parts, like, hey, Newtown is sort of the overall market. It's the market identity, so to speak. Right, so that instead of relying on an algorithm, right, people only have to, they only have to look for a logo, right, to understand that, hey, when I see this on a book in a bookstore, on a poster, on a film, or whatever, I know what it means. I know that it was produced in some manner. I know that it is in some manner, and in that it was funded in some manner, right? We sort of bypass. I mean, if an heterodox filmmaker has his film on, on YouTube, for instance, on Google, well, it's actually the Google store. Of course there'll be algorithm. That's fine, right? But as you said, earlier, it's not easy to create, but it's very easy to distribute now because everybody has screens on their hands. We have cloud computing, we have 5G. Um, and films are tough, but when it comes to books and music and video games, I mean, you can just put your game on Steam, or you can put it on GOG, or you can put, there's so many avenues now. And I mean, how do we meet each other? We meet each other through that post for board games, remember? So board games are a different beast because they are real, right?
Are there woke board game? I'm a huge board gamer, and I'm trying to envision this ideology even making its way into board games and how that would happen. But is it
I,
happening already?
Yeah, it is. It is. They're removing terms now because they find, it's like they don't. I'm not a board game guru, but I hear stories here and there. So like Wizard of the Coast will change a word in their upcoming edition of whatever game because
Uh,
it might mean something to a certain group of people, right? So they're caving in to you know
that never ends.
yeah, it never ends. It
They
never
were
ends.
doing that back with Dungeons and Dragons in the '80s, like taking out all the demons and the devils and the Satanic Panic. And
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, and we all know that it was BS back then, right? Because there was no epidemic of cults, in the '80s, right? So this is happening absolutely. Some of the publishers are caving in, but the market, when it comes to the sort of the major forms of culture, which is film, television, and music, the ones that are influence the people the most, they don't need to be real anymore. They could all be digitally distributed, right? And so there's for sure that there's someone on, I don't know, in Hungary, or that has a server farm that will gladly stream my film in 4K for 20% of the cut, right? There's no, but that didn't happen 15 years ago, 10 years ago. You had to be part of the industry. You had to have relationships with distributors because otherwise that was it. It was a very tiny circle, right? But now you can put your film on Google and you have they call it aggregators. So you have to go through an aggregator that will sort of look at your film and make sure that it's up to all the technical standards of Google and whatnot. But that's it. That's all it is. You pay them, $1,600 one-time fee, and that's it. The rest is between you and Google. I think they take about 40%, but there's no other distributor. You do your own marketing, right? That's big too because films, film in the industry are still like that. They still have distributors who cover the marketing costs. So all the money that comes in has to go to them first. They call it last in, first out, right? So that's why it takes years for people who invested in films to make their money back. But now the line is almost direct, and so there are ways to completely bypass not only the algorithm, right, but also to sort of send a signal out there that, hey, you don't have to look for 1,000 channels like Ben Shapiro's. Just look for one thing, Newtown, right? And so yeah, it simplifies. You can almost say that it's sort of a consumer advocacy group, right? We
that makes
we sort
sense.
of make sure that the consumers can easily find what they're looking for.
I grew up with the good. They had the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, and I never really knew what it was. I just knew it was a good thing, and if something had that on it, then that was the thing that you wanted. So it sounds similar to that. But say you, you have films, you have books, you have games, video games. Do you envision having them curated or aggregated on a central site or data? Like I'm thinking, why not just go the extra step and create a platform where, like Netflix, where people go and they can watch the movies all in one place. or they have a list of the books or a list of the games,
Mm.
and for
Well, for new, I don't look. Maybe one day I'll exit Newtown and will grow and be, like the founder of Wikipedia, for instance, or the person who founded Greg's List, or. But the idea of Newtown is that all it is a certification, right? We don't even promote in a sense. We'll have a sort of a release schedule, right? But it's like text, right? It's like, okay, December 2023, there's these movies, these books, these games. That's it, right? No posters, no nothing, right? So, but, and the idea behind that is well, there are many reasons for that, but the most important is that Newtown needs to remain simple,
no,
right? So because if it the more complex it gets, the more corruptible it becomes, right? And just like everything else, and it has to remain free too, in the sense that people will pay for the certification because something given has no value, but the people in Newtown who will, judge the culture that comes in to make sure that it certifies, these people will not get paid. There'll be perks, they'll have, probably have raffles and giveaways and whatnot, and that's fine. But just like Linux, just like Wikipedia, nobody is getting paid except maybe for a tiny core of people, right? But most of everybody on Linux that work on Linux, I've never received a dime for it, and yet it powers, pretty much most of the Fortune 500 companies' servers. Wikipedia is the same thing. Most everybody who contribute to Wikipedia, they just do it because they want to contribute, and that's it. So, and it's the way to go. It has to be driven by passion, because if it becomes driven by money, then it loses its purpose. Now, that being said, because Newtown is culture, right? It's meant to be given away, right? So anyone can say, I am Newtown, or we are Newtown, right? So let's say, for instance, that you're a bookstore owner, okay, and you realize over the years that, hey, those Newtown books are selling, so why don't I make a Newtown section,
hmm,
right? And you don't have to contact us for that. Go ahead, have fun, right? And if it helps your sales, then it's good for us, right? We don't receive a dime for that, right? Of course. We don't receive any dividends for things that are sold. We just, people pay for the certification. That's it.
and that's
That's the
it.
extent. That's the extent of where it goes, right? And so, but if to you it means increasing your profits, then go for it. And we're not going to ask you to pay for the banner and we may even have banners that we give away. Just you print it out, you pay for the printing, but here it is in PDF format. You can just download it from the site, right? And so, and as well, the idea also is to, when you give it to people, they tend to make it their own. So over time, the idea of some, very passionate people, starting a YouTube channel or starting a newsletter or a meetup group or whatever dedicated to Newtown is something that can happen, right? So it's meant to be organic. It's meant to be sort of given away, and people are people can just do what they want with it, in a manner of speaking, right? But in the beginning, we'll have sort of a, there's a newsletter that already exists, right?
Oh,
And so, we're still looking for our first artist. We just started, and the goal for the first year are very, very small. I mean, it's culture, right? We're seeing, the goals are more like 5 years down the road and 10 years down the road. But there'll be a scheduled release, of course, right? So that people in one place, either on the website or the newsletter, can just see for themselves, oh, okay, this is coming up, and here's a link. I'm going to go check that film on IMDb or whatever, right? So and because if the whole point of Newtown is to simplify consumer choice, why, what I mean? It's like, let's go, like you said, let's take one step further, but the step further still is just one step, right? It's not because, again, you also have to remember that if we become sort of a Patreon or a platform, then we just become a bottom-up solution, right? We just become sort of another thing that people have to remember. Whereas if we remain this sort of overall top-down thing that covers culture in its entirety, right? Then it's easier. Again, it's easier because remember that the core certification here, that has, I think they cover 70,000 food products
Oh,
in Canada, right? And you go on the core certification website, you don't even know. You don't even know which products they have. They don't even advertise anything, right? So, and I'm not saying that Newtown will, mimic that, but the idea is sort of the same in the sense that we just provide their certification, and you just like the people who create the food products, that's your job to promote your thing, right? We're not going to do that for you, right? It doesn't, the fact that you have the logo doesn't, it sort of makes it easy for people who are kosher, right? But that's it. That's sort of the extent that it has. And there's actually something now called the B Corporation. And so the B Corporation is actually the opposite of Newtown. Well, it's more for corporations than culture, but the idea of the B Corporation is that, well, it's almost like a woke certification, for lack of a
oh,
better word. And so the idea of the B Corporation is that I was in clubhouse rooms not too long ago, and it was all about sustainability and how can companies become more sustainable. And that room was dedicated to the entertainment industry, and I made a big post about it on Twitter, actually, in the Newtown account, because I wasn't surprised by everything that I heard, but the idea was that everybody in the room, was, I mean, first of all, there weren't like C-level people there. I looked at everybody on stage on the clubhouse, on stage in that clubhouse room, and I looked at their profile, and they were all pretty cool players, people who've done stuff that you've watched, right? Or maybe your neighbor has watched, not some, obscure film, that was just released in Brazil, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing was this room was about networking, was about putting ideas out and say, hey, you can do this, and I can, and it worked. I mean, it was a great room if you were in that space. And then, all of a sudden there was this fellow who has a animation film studio in London, an office in London, in New York, and LA. And he was like, oh, we're in the process of being B certified. So, and I knew the B Corporation, before that. So I knew exactly what he was talking about. And people were like, hey, what is this? So it's like, and then he started explaining the B certification. So essentially what it is that it looks at, as a corporation, it looks at what you do, how you do it, what kind of impact does your operation have on the surroundings where it is, right? Of course, what kind of DI initiatives you have in your company, but also in your HR department. What kind of outreach do you have in the community? Do you support, like local initiatives by whatever group or something, right? And of course, how much of your money how much of your profit do you sort of dedicate to sustainability in some form or another? They call it the ESG index, right? So I believe, if memory serves, I believe it's equitable, sustainable growth, something to that effect. And that's being pushed down by the asset management firms that control pretty much everything that's on the market, and as well as the Fortune 500. So it's just a sort of an extension of that. And Jeff, I mean, you wouldn't believe it. These guys can't keep up. They just can't. The process of being B certified takes years, and it's super costly. And they look at, you have to have your books need to be open. They want to know where your money comes from, right? So because they want to know that if they want to make sure that you don't have an investor that invest in selling arms to some country in Africa, or that or that he's involved in some petrol company in Venezuela or Norway or whatever, right? They want to push this, everything that has to do with sustainability and equitability and so forth, right? So there's actually efforts on the other side already on their way for that, and people go for it. They really go for it because it gives them that seal of approval, and the higher your ESG index, that's what it's become now. The higher ESG index, the more investable you become. And so when people are asking why are banks, running the pride flag on, in their windows, or what, it's like, well, that's what it is now. It's not virtue signaling. Well, you could say it's virtue signaling in some sense, but it's also it's about the big mamu, of course, right?
Are we on our way to a social credit system? That's what's reminding me. And it seems like a lot of work and effort for the feeling of moral superiority. Like that seems like the payoff for it. So I can watch this movie and feel morally pure about it. Is that all it is?
Well, I that's a really good question.
That it
I
serves a psychological function, but not much more than that. Like there's no practical difference between a B certified movie and any other movie. I'm gonna watch the one that gives me the greatest aesthetic experience, regardless of what that movie is. So
yeah, but at the
if
end of
people are taking years to certify a movie as B certified, it's not going to make that much difference when you're watching the actual movie itself. So the benefits seem to be social, psychological, cultural, more than they are anything tangible that's actually related to the experience of watching the movie.
Yeah, no, yeah. I don't think movies will be certified, but the companies that make them are, right?
Oh.
Whereas Newtown can certify individual pieces of
So
culture.
the B certifies entire corporations or
Yeah,
company, and then it's presumed any output from that
yeah,
corporation. Oh,
yeah,
I see.
exactly,
And
exactly.
Newton would tackle each product as a product on its own.
Well, yeah, that's so the Newtown certification is three things. It could either certify sort of individual artists, like an independent film producer, for instance, companies, or institutions like a book publisher, right? If you're a book publisher and you publish, I don't know, 50 books a year, you're not gonna certify every book, right? You might as well just have have the whole company certified, and everything that you output becomes Newtown certified automatically. And
Oh,
then we have the sort of the budding artist level, where if because the idea of Newtown is that it's overall. So if you, the consumer, and I could say us too, you and I, Jeff, if we recognize the Newtown logo on a big budget film, we're going to recognize the Newtown logo on a storefront theater in our community, right? It's the same thing. But the people who run that theater company, they don't have the same budget, right? And so the idea of the sort of the budding certification is that for 2 years, whatever you do is automatically certified, right? So if you're a musician and you release EPs, or that's great, because you can just produce your stuff, right? And have access to the same recognizability as the big time producers have when they have the logo on the screen, or on their books, right? And so but yeah, I mean, you're right. For when it comes to B corporation, it doesn't seem to me like it has the at the end of that line, so to speak, the consumer doesn't really benefit, really. um, but the cool thing about Newtown is that it does benefit, right? Because when the example that I used earlier, the choice on the screen, if you pick film B, right, because it's Newtown certified, and not really because it's certified, but because that because it is certified, it's something that you look for, right? It's something it's an experience that you'll probably enjoy more, because it wasn't produced in a tunnel vision, in an ideological tunnel vision, or it won't surprise you halfway through because suddenly it becomes woke. And I talk to people all the time, and some of them are telling me this now. It was all good until bang, halfway through, where there's all these jokes about white guys for some reason, and it's like, what? It's like, oh, okay. It sort of became woke at that point, and I sort of lost track, and I lost interest, and I shut it off. Right. So when you pick option B, you have a lot of power as a consumer here, because well, first of all, you didn't fund woke culture, right? You didn't give money to this big woke monster, right? And of course, at the same time, you supported, a filmmaker that is like you, that doesn't want to have anything to do with that, just wants to produce something and release it, and have, well, perhaps people like you say, hey, I had a good time, didn't try to brainwash me or my kids, halfway through, and thank you very much, right? So you supported an artist in that fashion. But more importantly, right, and that's sort of the third, that's where the third part of the certification comes into play, is that because at the end of the day, if the profit from that sale goes back into the sort of woke machine, because the distributor is, or the studio is, what I mean? What's the point of Newtown, right? So that's why Newtown culture in Newtown can only be, well, it will be it will come in levels, right? But the idea over time is that most, if not pretty much almost all of the money that was used to fund that piece of culture, whatever it is, came from people like you and I, who wants to, on a small, medium, or large scale, right? And so we sort of, Newtown act as a shield, right? It act as a separation between woke capital and not woke capital. And that's very important, because we have to stop that. I mean, I was watching a Claremont Institute talk that they had about, I think it was in June, and the Claremont Institute is a think tank in Washington, D.C. And it was the title was Woke Capital, and what are we going to do about it? And they're clueless. They don't know. They have no idea how to stop the growth and the power and the influence that woke capital has on every aspect of America. And so Newtown is sort of a solution in that regard. From a cultural standpoint, it doesn't really affect anything else, right? But at least it does something cultural, right? It uses money that exists already and sort of divert it, right? Divert it into something that's not woke, right? Because we don't allow it. That's a club reserved for heterodox, patrons and art lovers and investors, right?
It seems like we're tribalizing, or like we're almost forced to tribalize in response or in reaction. And there's arguments for and against that too. But you're right, I don't know the solution either, because I'm not ready to capitulate to the woke either. The little bit of woke art, like movies I've seen, my biggest criticism of it is aesthetic. It seems grafted onto the film in these little clunky play. It's not organic. It doesn't resonate with reality, and it mars the movie with this sense of, like, it's manufactured. I don't know. It's not organic. It does, the woke elements never arise organically out of the story. You can always tell where they're cut and pasted and added in and grafted on, and I just think it makes for bad art. Is that the logo behind you for Newtown that you're talking about?
Yes, that's the lady that's part of the bigger picture. She's sort of standing guard. Well, there's Newtown. There's the city behind her, right? We don't see this. The sort of you can see the beam of lights, right? The sort of lighter portions are beams of light, but I think what you're describing here is very common to any art that's used as propaganda.
Yeah, I think
So I mean, if you look at the all the great propaganda during the Second World War, right? Either it was for good or for bad. You look at Soviet propaganda, and then you look at American propaganda. It's like, we're going to go there, we're going to fight, and we're going to win, right? And of course, it's meant to rouse, and it's meant to elicit, a very strong emotional reaction, right? But what we are today is this woke thing it's all about people's identity, right? It's so everybody will react differently when they come across what you describe here, sort of a scene or a joke or suddenly a new direction. You can watch an episode. I remember when I was the first season of Jessica Jones on Netflix was amazing. I mean, completely amazing. And then 10 minutes in the first episode of the second season, you could tell it was all about men are bad. All men are bad. It's like, really? It's like, is this what this is about now? It's like, all the guys are evil. Jessica kicks them in the nuts, and and all the guys that make sense are super beta. It's like Flash. You know what I mean? So it was like, okay, and that it took maybe 15, 20 minutes. I was like, okay, I'm done.
You
Bye.
didn't finish the second season?
I didn't even finish the first episode of the second season because I'm like, okay, I'm done. And lo and behold, it was made known that the second season of Jessica Jones were going to be all female directors and all female writers, and it's like, don't go look very far to find why this happens, right? And it's stunning because the Council for the Arts a plan that they release. I mean, I've looked really deep into this, and for instance, the Directors Guild of Canada. There are 3 presidents now, and the first president is a male filmmaker who's Japanese Canadian. The second director is a female director who is the second president is a female director of a native. She's from she's a native Canadian, and then the third president is a female sort of producer, a delegate producer, and she's white though, but still. And these people have had tremendous career in the film industry for 30 years. No one has, it's all there on IMDb, right? So nobody was ever suppressed, right? Nobody was ever not offered opportunity because of who they were, right? But suddenly, because you're a woman, or because you're a son of an immigrant, or because you're native, suddenly, you have to have this sort of a priority, right? And it's weird because it's not a reflection of reality at all. It's like, hey, nobody's ever said no, you can't. It's like, why can't we have meritocracy here? Let the best idea win. Isn't that? I mean, that's what culture was. That's what culture had ever been. The biggest artists were the ones who found the biggest patrons. Back in Greek and Roman times and the Renaissance, and it's like, hey, if you're Bach, you write tremendously amazing music. You're going to have people who want to invest and say, hey, why I'm giving you this money, and why don't you write me a symphony, right? And so the culture was pure in a sense, right? Up until 20 years ago, 15 years ago, where suddenly the identity of the person who produces the culture is more important, right, than what they want to produce.
And you end up with propaganda.
And you end up
instead of culture. And Newtown is a way to offer culture again instead of propaganda.
Well, that's right, but it's both ways, right? It's a way for artists, right? Because artists in Newtown, you just produce whatever you want to produce, right? And that's the goal. And cancel culture doesn't exist in Newtown. Nobody will ever be canceled in Newtown. That's just, it's anathema, right? It's completely the opposite of what Newtown is about. And the other way, of course, is the consumer. It's like, hey, you're a consumer. You want to consume this. And that was the big takeaway as well from the research that I've done prior to, coming up with Newtown, was that people are there are two things. The average consumers understands, he really understands that when he buys, some woke piece of trash, at the cinema or a book or whatever, he understands that he's funding this monster, right? He's feeding this monster. But what is he going to do? Right? I mean, if daddy, the two girls, daddy, we want to go see the new Disney, animation. It's like, will daddy say, sorry, ladies, we're not going to do this because we're going to fund the woke, it's like, let's go. Right. But he knows when he makes that decision, he knows that he's giving his hard-earned cash to something that goes against his own best interests, right? That doesn't have any respect for him, whether on an intellectual level or for who he is, right? And that sentiment has been growing. Like, you see it in like Joe Rogan's comment sections or Daily Wire, YouTube channels, comment section. You see it, it's everywhere. It's sort of permeating, right? And so they understand on a visceral or a conscious level. Some people do on a conscious level. That's why they just stop, buying altogether, right? And the second aspect to that is that, well, it's like, okay, if I'm not going to buy it, what am I going to do? Right? It's like, where do I go if I want to consume culture during my leisure time, right? So it's like, where do I look? I'm a busy father of two. I don't have time to, to hunt around and go around. And it's like, I want to go catch this film, but I have to look it up on Wikipedia and go look up the producer and what he's produced. But you know what I mean? Who's going to do that, right? So that's why this sort of conjunction here. That's part of that's part of how Newtown came to me in a sense, right? It's like, hey, there's a need on the market for clarity, right? Because people want to consume culture, that's why it's culture, right? It's entertaining, it elevates our human experience, right? Through, like you said, it's beauty, right? It's about beauty, it's about the truth, it's about so many things, right? It's about things that we sometimes cannot do on our own, at all. We could never dream of doing this, so I'm not a musician, so I couldn't do anything with a guitar. So, even though I'm an artist in some sense, I'm not in others, right? So I get my kicks in other forms of culture, right? And I mean, we're all consumers at the end of the day, whether we're artists or not, really, right? So we all consume other pieces of culture just to have fun, just to inspire us or whatever it is, right? So so this sort of need for clarity it's very important. And so that's why I was talking about giving them the sort of market and identity, because people are looking for that kind of stuff, and it can't have multiple names because it's never going to go anywhere, right? And so that's why if you just group it all under one thing, then when Ben Shapiro releases a film or Joe releases a book, right, you, Jeff, or anybody else can just, again, just look for one thing, right? And it becomes sort of a seal of approval that, hey, the artist that created that, they want you to have an experience, right? They want you to have what cultural experience are supposed to be, right? So you don't have to worry, right? Sit back and enjoy, so to speak, and be amazed. Sort of finding a slogan here. But you know what? It really is. It really is a loss. But also you also have to understand that, let's suppose that, instead of picking film B, you pick film A, right? And film A is an independent film, for instance. Okay, let's just push the example here to the limit. So on average, an independent film will take at least 3 to 5 years from inception to release, right? Because it takes a long time to fund the film. You have to, of course, you have to write it, you have to produce it, you have to do all of this thing, and then you have to go to so many festivals, and boom, you find a distributor that loves it and puts it in the theater, or puts on Netflix, buys it, whatever. That's 3 to 5 years. So imagine if this film is woke, okay? This means that the propaganda, so to speak, in that film is 5 years old. But you're watching it now in 2021. So not only is it important to separate culture, to tribalize culture, I don't like the idea too. I wish culture would just be one thing, but that's sort of the thing that people don't understand is that, especially when it comes to the film, television, and music. If you watch something now that's woke, it's been in preparation for a long time. And so, what does that say about the culture that's been produced since then, the culture that's being produced now, and say, what about a screenwriter who watches this podcast next week or whatever, and he decides to include us in some, because he was just given the green light to write his rom-com, right? And his rom-com is about what, there's some wokeness in there, and he watches our podcast, and suddenly we're going to be portrayed. Maybe it's a tiny thing, maybe it's just one tiny scenes, but we're going to be portrayed in some fashion in his film that's 2-3 years down the road. How are we going to be portrayed? How will it survive the process of him writing characters in the script now, the director sort of putting his spice or her spice on top of it, and then the editor might do something to that too, right? It's the same thing for books. I mean, books are, some books takes a couple of years to make, it takes 3 years to write, so we're not, I mean, there's so much woke culture that's coming our way, it's unreal. So the need for clarity will only grow, unfortunately, as time goes on, right? And we have to make sure that Joe, Joe, father of two, doesn't give up, right? Because if he gives up, then he's just going to perpetually fund that system and send a signal.
Don't give up, Joe.
Yeah, that it's like, okay, I'm just going to buy whatever my kids want, and you know what I mean, and I'm not going to make an effort anymore. I'm just going to sit down in front of the TV and just whatever it is, I'll just watch it and say, and just just suffer through it, right? But when you do so, you're funding this thing, right? You're feeding this, right? Because you're sending a signal that, hey, we've had how many viewers, right? So we'll keep on producing them, right?
I have a feeling the daughters are still going to get to see their Disney movie, knowing what I know about kids and parents. But it sounds like Newtown at least gives Joe hope. Like there's hope for Joe. We were also going to talk a little bit about the genesis of Newtown and how.
Well, I sort of sprinkled it a bit throughout the talk so far, but the big break point for me was, I don't know if you see the sign there right next to the TV. So
it's like a QR code.
Yeah, well, it was a project. I made this sign because I wanted to go to sort of protests that were happening here in Canada and Toronto, and I knew that there were more like right-leaning people there. So, but at the time, I had a project back in the fall called the Freedom Film Society, and it was sort of a Patreon, exactly the opposite of Newtown in the sense that it wasn't top down, it was bottom up, right? So the idea was to have a sort of a Patreon, a crowd-funded channel where every month you'd have a short film that would tackle an aspect of wokeness in a sort of a Black Mirror fashion, concepts, hard-hitting concepts that really go all the way, right? But then you guys, the election in America hit me, and it really hit me hard, because I really thought that, deep down inside, I really thought that the silent majority in America would, pinch their nose and just go, okay, we'll just put Trump again, because, the Democrats are just going way too woke, and this is not a direction we want to go, right? So I really thought that the silent majority would seize upon that opportunity to just sort of reject this woke direction that this society was going. And we all know what happened, right? And it's sort of, that's when it sort of sent me into this research mode. It's like, whoa, why is this happening? And I happen to be the sort of a visionary type of entrepreneur. And I don't mean that as a boasting thing. I mean that as a category. There are different types of entrepreneurs, and I've always been the visionary guy. I see trends, before they happen. I see, and it really has to do with temperament, really. I think I really just have this sort of and I think probably innovators in general have, you just have to sort of the right combination of the big five personality traits, right? Openness and conscientiousness and all the others. And so when you have this sort of right mixtures, you just you have this sort of sixth sense about sort of the collective and conscious, and you see that played out in how people behave, right? And so so for instance, back in 2003, when I funded my own production company, I worked in hotels and restaurants for many years before that, and I was like, hey, the internet and all, and hotels, they need video on their website, video that shows, it's so frighteningly simple when you think about it. But in 2003, we still called high-speed internet, right? There's almost still a separation between, I think dial-up was dialing down at that point, but it was still sort of brand new. I mean, it was before smartphones and everything, right? So social media and whatnot. And so that summer in 2004, I was living in Montreal back then, and I sort of just cold knock on hotels' doors and spoke to marketing directors and say, hey, I just started my own company and I want to offer you a video for your website, and it's a bit pricey, but it's like, hey, I'm going to come here, I'm going to do all this, I'm going to shoot all the rooms, and it's going to look amazing, very cinematic like and whatnot. And they all looked at me like I was from Mars. They just didn't get it. And of course, lo and behold, 3-4 years later, they all had it. Right. So that's when I started realizing, okay, maybe there's something there. And it's not something that's conscious. It's almost like a sponge, you sort of, your mind, when you're an innovator, you just absorb all that sort of information out there. And then one day you wake up and boom, you sort of connect all the dots. Right. And so that's sort of what happened in November. I went into research mode. I was like, what's going on? And, I've been following all the Joe Rogans and Ben Shapiro's, for a long, long time. And that's probably why I was gathering information and what people were saying in their comment sections and why were they saying that. And even on torrent websites, people about 2 years ago, I started seeing on torrent in comments on torrent website, it's like, how woke is this film? Right. So even pirates who are a click away from downloading a free copy of the film will not do that if the film is woke. And that's why they ask. Right. So they would rather watch paint dry than suffer through a woke film. And so imagine if the fringe of the consumers, the very fringe of the consumer base is acting like that, then it's just that means something else is around the corner, right? And so I just research, and it's like, what's going on? Is there anything like Newtown, right? Is there anything out there that's that's promoting culture that is, that's just culture that's heterodox, right? And I was like, no, there's nothing. And I studied think tanks, and studied hundreds of think tanks, and no one had any interest in culture whatsoever. None of them. So of 200, and I literally mean 200 think tanks that I've looked into, that I've studied, and I would say all of them were sort of center right, either center or right leaning or libertarian leaning, and none of them. There was one, maybe, I think it's here in Canada, the Fraser Institute, but all the others, none of them had any fellows that came from culture or had any interest in culture. And think tanks they study, right? They have field of studies, and none of them had culture in any sense whatsoever. So the sort of elite intelligentsia sort of never saw that coming. And of course, they're completely clueless on how to go about solving the problem. And so that really took me by surprise. I mean, come on. I mean, you're think tanks. I mean, it's in the name. You're supposed to think about, it's very political, I understand, but you're supposed to detect problems in our society and come up with solutions along the way. That's your job, right? I mean, that's why you get paid the big bucks, really. That's why you have lobbying power. That's why you have, you know what I mean? I mean, that should have been right up their alley, but no, there's nothing. So that, little by little, this sort of, it's sort of all sort of codify everything, right? And that's when I realized that this Freedom Film Society was just sort of the chrysalis stage. It sort of became Newtown in that sense, because no, we can't have just a channel that's going to do that. It needs to be something that's overall, right? And at first, because I'm a filmmaker, I was just thinking about films, but then I realized, well, if it's a certification, and it can be applied to anything, really. It's like, why don't we just go, all culture, right? So the idea of Newtown really is that, hey, we're going to have a party on this side of the fence, right? We're going to have artists who are going to do what they want. We're going to have, you know what I mean? And it's going to be fun. And you guys stay over your side. And if you want to join us, you're free to come. It's open to everyone, right? But the rules are, you create culture, nothing else, right? If you want to create something else, that's fine. You can do it. We're not about censoring people, right? You can do whatever you want. Newtown is not an obligation, right? But it's just like the core certification is not an obligation, right? But if you have it, you're sending a signal to Jeff and Philip and a bundle of others that, hey, this piece of culture is right? It's just culture. Right. So the idea is that if you want to have quick access to us, because we're a consumer base, and let's be real here, everybody that's right of center probably feels the way we feel right now, right?
I'm left of center, and I still feel that way.
Well, there you go. And I actually include the moderate left as well in this, because there's a lot of people on the moderate left that can make the difference between, hey, I want to consume culture now, not have, the ideology of the screenwriter shoved down my throat.
Absolutely.
Right? So there you go. Right. So there's a time for everything, but yeah, so the consumer base here is pretty big, pretty gigantic. And so, that's all it is. If you're a cultural producer and you want to have access to that market that's growing, then, you can have certified. But if you don't want to, don't go for it. It's not like nobody's putting a gun to your head, right? It's completely complementary, right? It's as complementary as you can imagine. And if you want to do a woke film, go do your woke film, and good luck. We're not going to censor you, but you can't apply to Newtown. And let's face it, people who produce culture, who just wants to produce culture, they're going to be attracted to Newtown, right? It's like, oh, that's the kind of people I want to reach out to, right? So, I mean, at first, I don't believe we're going to have woke people are going to try, because they're like, no, it's the polar opposite. Why would we go there, right? And so, yeah.
Maybe we need a think tank on culture, or a cultural think tank. The way you describe culture as belonging to everyone, and I'm so impressed by you keep hearing about the solution to wokeness is to build your own institutions, build your own non-woke versions. Bari Weiss, I think, just put out a big article on just that topic. And I'm seeing so many communities crop up weekly in response to wokeness. Jody Shaw and Corey Drayton just started an arts organization to produce non-woke art videos. I forgot where I was going with this. My mind completely went blank.
You know what?
But the spirit of culture belonging to everybody. I'm thinking of these communities, and there's so many people working in this spirit right now. So I can see the advantage of having some overarching collective or brand or group or little think tank or something devoted to culture. In fact, I would like to have you back and do an entire podcast on what is culture. And
I'd love that. But you know what? It's so funny that you mentioned Jody, because, and this is all fresh. This just started like a mere week ago. Well, it's been in preparation for a bit, but So Newtown is part of a consortium called the Institute for Liberal Values.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was launched by Jennifer Richmond and David Bernstein, and David is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and so the idea of the consortium is that so we have there's Counterweight, Ellen Pluckrose Counterweight,
I'm part of
part of
Counterweight.
us. A Free Black Thought is part of the consortium as well. Jody Shaw is part of us as well with her organization called Integrity Matters, right? So that's she's working on that. And there's also a few others, and of course Newtown, right? So and so the idea is that we collectively together we represent the safeguard, right, and of liberal values, right, and in the classical sense. And of course for us Newtown, we're all about culture, but then Free Black Thought is about free black thought and so forth, right? And so now the cool thing about the consortium is that it's all nonprofit, and we have access to the Title 501(c) in America. So we're here. I'm the only one in Canada. Everybody else is in America, but so what we have access now is that people can have a tax deduction on their donation, right? So they can donate to the institute, and choose whoever they want to support. Right, so they want to support Newtown for what we do, then they support Newtown, and they have access to a tax deduction, right? And so that's great because, and not to mention the credibility of rubbing shoulder with all these people, right? So there are indeed organizations that are growing and are coming together, right? Sure. You have FAIR. I mean, FAIR is its own thing, right? And FAIR is about
is that Fair for All?
Yeah, that's right. So Fair for All is about education, right? It's right. With Paul Rossi, and it's funny because Paul he found Newtown. I mean, I think a month after I went online, and he just sent an email. It's like, no, he didn't send an email. He subscribed to the newsletter. And I said, Paul Rossi at FAIR. It's like, what is this FAIR? That's how I got to know about them. And then it's like, hey, I got in touch with him, and now he's thanks to Barry Weiss, who published his essay in her Substack, he's and he was also on the Jordan Peterson podcast. So Paul has gained some notoriety, but he's an amazing guy, and I applaud his courage. I mean, geez, his story is so unbelievable. I mean, it's like he was canceled in slow motion, Okay. Yeah, it's just unreal, so anyway, so that's the idea of the ILV, the Institute for Liberal Values, is that there are people out there who are creating their own organizations and doing their own part, and that's the cool thing about, you see what Jody is doing is that she's doing sort of a bottom-up thing, and Newtown is doing the top to bottom. So we both complement each other, right? Right. So and that's great. As we complement, Ben Shapiro and his production company and all the others, right? Because we could just all unify under this banner, and make it clear and simple for everybody, right? And the consumers, the one thing that was cool though is that, when I first launched Newtown, I sort of tailored the message for different audiences to see, who was going to buy it, and the two main audiences that really, bit into this was, well, people like Ellen and Judy, these sort of academic intellectuals, the ones that are heterodox and look at Newtown. It's like, hey, it's like, wow, that's a good idea, and worth my time investigating. And so we had a good feedback from these people, but the people who really got it are the consumers, so I did a lot of experiment on Clubhouse. We have a club on Clubhouse too, so you can check it out as well. But I would just talk to people, and say, it's like, hey, have you heard about Newtown? What is this? Oh, it's like, you tired of woke culture? Yeah, I'm sick and tired of this. And it's like, well, Newtown is just a logo on this that tells you, that it's not woke. It's like, really? Yeah. It's like, do I have to be a member? No. Do I have to pay for something? No, it's free. It's like, it's like, like, really? Wow. It's like, is there a Patreon? No, there's no Patreon, nothing. You just have to remember the logo and the name. Really, that's all you. It's like, wow, okay. It's like the consumers get it. For the consumers, like, oh my God, it's simple again. I don't have to second guess, or you know what I mean, or push play and sort of with a step back, right? It's like, what is this going to be? Right, I could just push play and enjoy, right? So yeah, so the consumers are really responding to that, and I'm not surprised. Again, with all the research that I've done, that I was alluded to earlier, it sort of made sense, right? But yeah, there is a lot of stuff going on in the background, and we have to, Jeff, because if nobody's doing anything, I mean, we're just going to see our society just slide further into this woke thing, and God knows where it's going to go. And it might not be something we want to go, a place we want to go. Certainly I don't want to go there. And who was this? I think it was somebody in Australia. I mean, we all know what's going on in Australia now, right? And it's becoming crazier. And this guy, yeah, he just did a TikTok video, and he was saying, hey, we've had sort of leftist, liberal, very liberal governments for 20 years. It's like, we should have seen this coming. It's like, when it's not kept in check, when we don't have, that's the great thing about America, because you sort of always have this, how do you say this? The balance, right? It's like, for one mandate or two, it's Republicans, and then it's, there's balance here, right? It always goes one way and then they go back. And but in countries like Australia, here in Canada, and you can have governments that are left-leaning for years and years and years. Even if they don't have majority governments, they can make, they can be a minority government, but make, alliances with even further left, parties, and remain in power. You know what I mean? And create institutions that will, and the thing I was telling you about the council earlier, this is the straw that broke my back. I mean, look, the situation in this country right now is that my income tax, I am now funding, they call it a crown corporation. So the Council for the Out is a crown corporation. So it's a corporation made by the government to serve the people, right? So my income tax is now funding a crown corporation that will not provide me with opportunities while calling me the oppressor. And there was no vote here. It was just done. It was made. It was no bill. Like we have Bill C-10 and Bill C-36 that were, fortunately, they failed. And, it looks like the election is going to be going in the liberal way, which is wow. But the conservatives here are so liberal that, it's like, who knows what they're going to do. But still, it's like, this is done. It's going. We have 10 years of the strategic plan is 5 years, but technically speaking, culture takes a long time to make. So whatever the next 10 years in Canada are going to be, culture will be in one mind, and it's all funded by our own money. So it's like, whoa, this is, and me personally, I'm done. I'm moving to Florida in 2 to 3 years.
Oh wow, you're the second Canadian I know that's trying to get out.
Yeah, well, on a personal level, I'm single, I don't have kids, there's nothing really holding me here. And it's not like I can't do movies, or do Newtown, you know what I mean? I could just do what I'm doing wherever I want, right? So I'm sort of very lucky in that sense. But, it's like, whoa, this is, hey, and I was a proud Canadian 20 years ago. At 20 years ago, I was still of the school of thought that, it's like, if you want to have a good time abroad, you put a Canadian flag on your backpack, right? Because everybody is going to welcome you with open arms, and maybe they still do. But right now, I would be ashamed of putting that flag on anything. It's like, no, it's like this is not the country I grew up in. This is not. It doesn't make sense. It really is like, and nobody in the media talked about it. No one. It went completely silent. So something as profound as an entire production of culture, an entire cultural output from a country will go in one direction and nobody talks about it. There's no law. It wasn't a bill that was voted on in the parliament. It was just done. you know.
That's top
So
down to me.
that's top. There you go. That's top down. That exists. And the thing is that, you have each provinces have their own councils and big cities have their own councils, but they don't. It's not like they're tiers of the same system. They're funded by different levels. So the Ontario Council for the Arts is funded by, the income tax on Ontarians, right? Not on people that are living in other provinces. But the people who run these organizations, it's all the same group. They're of the same mindset, right? So, so it's we call the word systemic is everywhere now. Well, this is systemic, right? So, and I even heard I was like, oh my God. But I was in a clubhouse room, a few months ago, and it was about Canada for some reason, and the discussion veered into culture, and there was this guy who says, "Hey, I'm a Canadian filmmaker. I live in Toronto," which is me, could have been me, and he said, "I was born here, but my mother is from Iran." Okay, and so when I fill the application form, the funding application form for either the Council for the Art or Telefilm Canada, or whatever, I take the South Asian books, right, instead of Caucasian or whatever, because I know that it's going to give me a lot more chances. So, the game is rigged. It doesn't even do its purpose, right? It's already corrupted, right? People are taking advantage of the system, right? So it's a complete mind f. I'm not gonna say the word here. Keep it friendly, but you know what I mean, right? It at least if it served the purpose, right? But it doesn't. It's just there for people to abuse it already,
Mhm.
and for people in position of power to just have power, really. You know, it's a power grab. There's
That's what
nothing.
it seems like to me too. It has me worried. Well, Florida has nice beaches.
Yes, and I'm looking at the western coast, the Gulf Coast, with beautiful sunsets, and
That's
yeah,
where we used to do our beach camping. Oh, it's gorgeous.
yeah, yeah,
Absolutely gorgeous.
yeah. Maybe south of Tampa, Naples, in that area. That's the kind of place I really would
Um,
rock my boat. And it's I've always been a city guy, but with COVID and everything, you realize that living in big cities, it's not a cool thing anymore, because they lock down everybody. How many businesses have closed, and so it's like, no, it's I think a smaller
I'm the same way.
place.
I just got out of Seattle and I've never been happier. Like, and the
Oh,
wokeness is a bubble. Once I left Seattle, where I'm at now is normal. Like, there are still normal places with normal people out there. So, a lot of the woke is localized in specific places, and it makes you think reality is one way. When you leave the bubble, you see that it's not. There's still that diversity out there.
um, yeah, from people, but I would say from a cultural perspective, it's not entirely the case,
I
because
think the people outside are just less affected by the culture. Like, it's the culture is just not as influential to them as it is in the cities.
no, no, you're right. But what I'm trying to say here is that the local culture, um, and the state culture or province culture, in Canada, it's still the same, because let's say you're a stage director, and whether you're in Portland or you're in Naples, Florida, or New York or Toronto, if you want to have access to the best actors, stage actors, you need to do what they call it equity, right? So, or whatever the name is. I know there's equity in pretty much every city, but these are the unions, right? The unions that the best actors belong to. And the actors, in these unions, guess what? They're super woke, right? So, and I've been in touch with someone in Portland. I mean, Portland, Oregon is woke central, but she's been married. She's been canceled for a long time, and her story is very sad. But she soldier on. She does all kinds of stuff. She's an amazing voiceover actress. She's a dialect coach, and she was accused of the ultimate sin of trying to teach dialect to a person of color while not being a person. I mean, are you kidding me? Right? That's how it is in the dialect coach circle now. If you're not black, you can't teach black people dialect. You know, that's it. You know, and they'll even go further as that you're a woman. If you're a man, you can't teach women. You know, it's like it's crazy. It really is crazy because I don't know. That's when I told you earlier that you know the people industry. You know, woke culture is woke for a reason because people are very progressive
That's
in
not
this sphere,
progress.
right? So the unions are, so the associations are, so the local organizations who fund local culture have DEI mission statement. You know, they want to hire, even though they're a small team of 20 people or 15 people, right? They have, you know, they do DEI with their HR department, right? And so it goes to, you know, if you take that logic further, well, they're going to fund, you know, they're going to, you know, whatever money, pool of money they have from, you know, benefactors, they're going to fund, you know, projects, you know, theater or whatever it is, puppet shows, whatever it is, right? They're going to fund shows that promote diversity, right? Or promote whatever. So it really filters down, you know, what we see from Hollywood and the big wigs, you know, it's a representation really of what's going on at large, right? Even on a state and city level, right? So that's why that when I thought about it, I said to myself, it's that's why we have this sort of certification for budding artists, right? Because they need to be able to hang on to a symbol that's sort of overall, right? So that they're in local efforts. You know, if you're just a guy with a guitar that gigs, you know, it's like, hey, you know, I have a gig, but you know, I subscribe to this type of, you know, thought. And if you, you know, if you've seen films or things that are Newtown, then you know you can support me as well because I'm part of that, right? You can come to my tiny show of 50, you know, 50 place, right? 50 seat in that small, you know, venue, right? And still benefit from, you know, the visibility, right, of that symbol. Because it's important to sort of go at it from both perspective, right? Top down and bottom up.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really is bad out there. And I was reading an article in Maine. There's an entire theater production company that shut down next year, their entire year of production because they couldn't get people to, you know, they wanted to have a vaccine mandate. They wanted to mandate everybody in their you know, that will be part of the plays for that company to have vaccines, and some actors didn't want that, and you know, so they just canceled the entire year.
Oh, wow.
Boom. So
Well,
it's
I grew up punk, and the best culture was always underground. It was never in the mainstream. So if this restores some kind of aesthetic underground and we get some good quality, I'm fine with that. And I'm glad people like you are stepping up into this space.
Well, you know,
So
it's,
thank
it's
you.
funny you mentioned punk because I grew up metal, you know, well, prog, prog rock a little bit, but metal, you know, Megadeth and Anthrax, and you know, and I was talking to someone, well, the guys in the podcast last week. I was like, where are the metal gods? Where are these people that, you know, had great songs about social problems, and you know, and now we actually see Rage Against the Machine doing the things that they were screaming about back in the 90s. You know, it's like, you know, F you, I'm not going to, you know what I mean? It's like, but now they're doing, you know, they're actually mandating vaccines in their shows, right? They're forcing people to have stuff, you know, and you know, I'm pro-vaccine. That's fine, you know. It's like go for it, you know. But it's, you know, it's like, you know, I grew up listening to your music, you know. You were all about anti-establishment, you know what I mean? And it's like, what happened to you guys? What happened to those trash metal gods that wrote amazing songs about how society was unfair and we had to help each other and so forth? It's like, where are you? Why don't you write songs for today's, you know, issues? Where are the punk bands, you know, that
Where are
write
the punk?
for,
Yes, where are today's punk bands?
yeah.
There's a band, a death metal band called Gorod that was recommended to me that I think I'm gonna check out after this podcast. So that's gonna be my attempt to try to find the new bands.
Yeah, because you know these are, and you know, it's like punk. The whole reason of punk is to really give the finger, huh? It's like, I'm an individual, and you're not going to tell me anything, and you know, so I'm going to do what I want. And I mean, if there's one thing that's against that today, is really is the woke thing, right? It's like, it's like, hey, you are this. No, I'm an individual, right? I do what I want. I create what I want. You know what I mean? It's like, you're not going to dictate my creativity, or you're not going to, put, horse, blinders, right? And around my eyes, I just, produce stuff the way you want me to produce or whatever. So, but maybe we're just ahead of the curve, man. Maybe this generation now, there's some kids right now, 12 years old, 13 years old, discovering dad's CD. Our generation, it was dad's vinyl, right?
Right.
But now
Yeah.
they're discovering dad's CD, right? And it's like, hey, it's the Ramones, or it's Danzig, or whatever it is, or it's Anthrax or Megadeth, or and Metallica, of course. Well, Metallica is still going, but their best albums are way behind them, although the last two were pretty good. But and they'll say, wow, what is this raw energy? What is this, finger to the establishment? And it's like, I see this, you know what I mean? Everything is a cycle, huh? So millennials and Gen Zs are, I believe they're lost, unfortunately. I don't think there's anything we can do with them. But the new ones that's coming up, that sees all of the, and remember that there's a kid right now. There's a kid right now, right here in Canada, that's an amazing filmmaker, right? That has tremendous potential, and that's going to go to the CFC in maybe a year or two and realize that, sorry, kid, you're a boy and you're white. You're never going to get in, right? It's like, wait a minute, that doesn't fly with me, right? So it has nothing to do with the institutions or the people in the power positions right now, right? So time, is our greatest ally. It's like, this kid will lose all of its illusion against, the establishment that is like, wow, I want to be a filmmaker. It's like, well, if you want to be a filmmaker, tough luck, And in Canada, in the US, it's all very all free market economy, which is great. But here, like I, been saying, all along, it's, there's so many ways in this country where you can, attain that position, really. And the CFC is one of them. If you go through the CFC, you got all the doors open. You'll have gigs doing publicity, spots, TV spots, and you'll have gigs, you'll probably be given a gig for doing, episodes of a TV show or something, so it really opens the door. Right.
But
So,
how much creative autonomy comes with it? Like, don't you have to compromise your vision along the way as
well,
you?
that's the thing. But the kids who are, but that's the thing, Jeff. The kids today, the ones that have been coming out of the CFC in the last few years, they're all woke, so they're fine with this. They're fine with just doing woke stuff. But the ones who are denied entry now, right, and the ones who are denied entry because, like the guy I mentioned earlier, they can't check the South Asian box, right? And
I don't check
be,
white. I check other. I'm Cajun.
well,
I check other. So I think even if you're white, check other, because if they're going to start dividing by demographic, skew it as much as you can.
yeah, but they'll look it up. You can't get away from that. And not to mention that when it comes to film too, you have to be backed by a producer, right? And I had discussions with producers 3 years ago, 2018. It's like, hey, if you haven't done your first feature by now, forget it. You're never going to make features in this country, because no producer is going to, because the odds of getting money because your director is a white guy are so slim, that no producer will, you know what I mean? For a producer now, it's better to have a black female director, because the chance of him getting money just because of that fact is astronomically high.
I'm a
Right.
black female. I identify as a black female. Can a kid make a movie on their phone and their computer video editing and then submit it somewhere and just on the merits of the film alone get backing, or is it like the politicization is complete and there's no way to get around
Well,
it
at
now?
least in this country, it's getting very hairtight, very hairtight. But that's the cool thing. What we have on our side is technology, right? So we can, or someone can just rent a theater and put a sort of a Newtown production, I was reading a production of Romeo and Juliet in England not too long ago, maybe last week. They put up warning signs, you know, safe space, Romeo and Juliet. Hey, this play has blood and suicide and blah blah blah. It's like, well, I think we know. And they actually had a screen.
I saw that. I was yeah. I
Right?
think
So
I
they
had
had a
posted a
screen,
tweet.
with text rolling in as the play was going. It's like, are you kidding me? Right? So someone who wants to, do a storefront production of Romeo and Juliet, and just put it as is, can easily say, hey, this is going to be a Newtown Romeo and Juliet, right? It's going to be a classic the way it's meant to be, and there's no trigger warnings here, right? Or something to that effect. Or a kid who wants to do a film, maybe he can't afford, the budding certificate. That's fine, he can still has this sort of unofficial, sticker that we're going to have. It's like, hey, I'm Newtown, right? That's fine. Go for it, buddy. So put that at the end of your film. You know what I mean? So, or in the beginning or whatever it is in your post, right? Just hashtag, Newtown, that's good, man. Go for that. Right. So, and that's the thing too. It's a hashtag, right? That plays, you were talking about algorithms earlier, right? So that's a cool thing too. It's like hashtags, right? Right. That's a way to rig the algorithm, so to speak. Right. And I think technology, we're at a point now. I mean, 10 years ago, it would have been very, very tough. But now with technology and it's like kids, they have this in their hands, very, very young, and, they find stuff very easily. Right.
Oh yeah.
So that's that. I think that's working in our favor too, and there's one thing too, is that, with hopefully with the money we're going to start to raise with our implication in the Institute for Liberal Values, I have in mind a great PR campaign. I think it's high time that we, take the fight to them, so to speak, and saying, because I mean, there's some organizations that are fighting the woke, and they say so in their marketing, right? But it's not like they're sending a message to the woke themselves, right? But since Newtown is about culture at large, right? I have ads already, like very short, tiny ad films, like 60 seconds, right? Stories that explains Newtown, but is poking at the woke very hard. And I've done some testing before launching it, and boy, when the woke will really realize what Newtown is, they're gonna be pissed. Because they understand there's nothing they can do about it, right? It's all consumer based, really, right? So that's and it sort of harks back to your question about having a platform, right? That's why we don't need a platform, because if we don't have a platform, then nobody can shut us
go
down.
anywhere, everywhere.
Right. And if the structure of Newtown, the organization itself is based on open software, open source software, and it's hosted somewhere in Switzerland or in Cyprus, or what I mean. It's like, that's it. They can't take us down, right? And so that's another reason why it needs to remain simple, right? Because the simpler it is, the more evasive it can be, right? It's like the mouse evading the elephant, legs, right? It's like it could just skim through, right? And so yeah, but it's that's another thing. We always have to keep that advantage in our pocket. But yeah, I think there's room for hope. There's room for hope.
I think so too, especially
Yeah.
after having you here today and hearing you. If somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way? If you give me links after this is over, I'll be sure and put them in the description. But what's the best way for someone to reach you for more information?
Well, and also artists, if you have artists that, watching, we'd love to get in touch. We, whatever it is that you do, and whatever the scope is as well, if you're an established artist or a budding artist, but it's, on Twitter, Newtown, hashtag, at Newtown Culture. So that's the great way. And we don't have our main website yet. It's part of a domain that I have for a film that I'm preparing. So It's a severanceday.com/Newtown, but we'll have the newtownculture.org soon, as soon as it's possible. But on that page, people can subscribe to the bulletin, right? So be kept in the loop, kept in the know, and what's going on, and also about the ILV. We have a small section that we talk about the ILV, because the goal of the Institute for Liberal Values is that all the members of the consortium help each other, right? There's a lot of networking done, and like my expertise is in film and video, so I'm bringing this to the table, right? So I'm helping the other members with that, and they'll help me with whatever they can help me with, so that's cool as well. It really is a network of people that supports each other. Because of that, I reserve a portion of the bulletin, each issue of the bulletin, to that, because if we help one, we help the other, right? But yeah, it's at Newtown Culture on Twitter, on Clubhouse, and on the page as well, and it's growing. Now we're still in the stage where this is the second podcast, because we're sort of growing, and we're at 300 and something in Twitter followers, and it's growing, and it's starting to, I start to see sort of a snowball effect. There's some new I start to see new followers without sort of an input on my own, right? So once in a while, like popcorn, it's like poof, you got one there, then you got poof, you got another. So it's starting to, and that's cool, because people just like you, man, they sort of start to know what it is, and it's like, hey, and it's all about the what they call the law of diffusion and of innovation, right? So when you have an innovation, at first you have the innovators, the people who go and like, wow, this is a cool idea, I'm buying it, right? But that's a very small portion of the population, and then suddenly you have the early adopters, right? That will be probably influenced by the innovators, right? So if you like the idea of Newtown, and you talk to someone who might not be, warm to the idea, but because it comes from you, right? Suddenly it's like, hey, well, if Jeff takes 20 minutes of his time to tell me about Newtown, maybe I should look into it, right? So and so forth. That's why it's sort of every new product, every new idea goes to this stage, right? Where it's very slow. You need a sort of a core. I mean,
that's happening with crypto right now too.
Yeah. Crypto is the best example. 10 years ago, crypto was nothing. That's this sort of. I mean, was crypto already out 10 years ago?
I don't know. I just really heard of it I knew it was out there, but I really just heard of it seriously probably this year.
Yeah.
Or last year.
Well, that's sort of on me, a personal level, I could say maybe 3 years. Yeah, but and then I that's the thing I want to do, maybe throughout some NFTs as well, some Newtown NFTs. I'm going to talk. So if there's any illustrators, painters out there, get in touch.
I'm going to promote Newtown and the communities I'm part of, because we do have a lot of creators and creative people, and we're always working on creative projects. So that's one vector I could promote.
So yeah, let's keep in touch then. Absolutely.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to talk to me, and that, I'm fine with that. I mean, they have everything we did here, is up for grabs. You can just watch it, and I mean, really have a great grasp of what it is. I don't think there's anything I can add here that will explain Newtown further. Everything is in what we talked about here, really. But yeah, so I'm open to talk to anyone who wants to know more, has questions, whatever it is, that's fine. But yeah, so it's I mean, that's the cool thing. You remember the Chinese Communist Party was founded by 12 guys in a shack. So, but that's what it is, and unfortunately it endures to this day. But every innovation goes through that phase. It's a small nucleus of people, and then it grows out of this, like a wheel, like a Ferris wheel, right? It grows, and so we're still brand new, and we're asking people to think about culture in a very different manner. So it's going to take time, but I'm very proud of the progress so far in mere months. It's growing, and now with the ILV and the institute it's great, because we're going to have activities, we're going to have events with them as well, right? So we're going to be under sort of the same marquee as all of
Right.
the others organization, right? So it's great credibility in that regard. And so, yeah, the next year is going to be amazing.
Well, I'm
Be
excited.
amazing. Well, thank you
Well,
so much, Jeff,
yeah.
for your time and for
Thank,
your amazing questions. I mean, that was great. I mean, you really nailed all of them, and
well, I
yeah,
love culture, so thank you for being available to chat. And I'll get this posted the next hour or so and
well, that's
put the
great. Thank you
links
so
in.
much.
If you
And
have any
let's,
other links you want me to include, just shoot them to me.
yeah, I'll send you an email. Absolutely. Let's keep in
Okay.
touch. And on Twitter
Yep.
too, it's nice to have, and we can chat together about that other thing.
Sure. Yeah.
The other
And I
thing we
really
talked
would
about.
like to have you back at some point to talk more about culture too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you have want to tackle in a different angle, even without Newtown, that's fine. Yeah, I'd love that. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you again, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, take care.